Hi, I'm Mikey. Welcome to my sewing room. Today I have another sew with me video and I'd love to talk to you about this dress, which is the Lily dress from Bel'Etoile Patterns. The pattern is suitable for beginners and I have linked it down below if you'd like to follow along. If you do follow along, feel free to tag me in your finished versions on Instagram too. It comes with an A4 print at home version, an A0 copy shop version, the instruction manual and some projector files as well. There are 3 different sleeve finishes to this dress and 2 different lengths, so it's nice and versatile. There's also loads of information about how you can make modifications to the pattern pieces to make them fit better. It does include layers, so you can print out just the pages that you need, which I'm a big fan of, and also there is a printing chart included which tells you exactly which pages to print for the version that you want to make. I'll be making the ruffle sleeve version today and I'll walk you through the steps and break down some of the more complicated parts. I've also thrown in some hints for beginners, just some methods that I found useful when I was first starting out. It is quite a long video and I have included timestamps, so feel free to skip to the part that you want to see. And with that, let's get over to the sewing table and get started. Let's start by having a look at the pattern pieces. I'll be making the ruffle sleeve version. We have piece A, which is the front bodice, piece B, the back bodice, and piece C, the neckband. Piece F is the upper skirt, piece G is the lower skirt, and piece H is the sleeve ruffle. I'm folding my fabric in half because all of the pieces for this pattern are cut either double or on the fold. I'm going to start with the lower skirt because this is the biggest piece, and I'm going to double my fabric again to allow me to cut 2 on the fold. Because the skirt pieces are symmetrical, they're rectangles, that means I don't need to worry about the direction of the print on the fabric right now, so I can cut them out this way and then turn one of them the right way around once I've cut them out. Now the fold of the fabric runs up the side and I've also got a fold up at the top. I like to cut my fabric with a rotary cutter, so I'm going to be using some pattern weights and some quilting rulers to help me with any straight lines. Moving on now to the upper skirt, and I'm going to cut that out in exactly the same way. So I'll double the fabric again, place the pattern piece on top, and I'll use my quilting ruler to help me cut some nice straight lines. You can see that once again I have the fold over to the side and one at the top, meaning I'll be able to cut 4 layers of fabric at a time, giving me 2 identical pieces. I'll just flip that piece over so that they're both the same way up, and that's the skirt. Now I'm going to move on to the bodice, and the back bodice is cut with the fabric doubled but not on the fold. The neckband's cut on the fold, but it's also cut on the bias. If you haven't cut on the bias before, that means that it's cut at a 45-degree angle when compared to the selvage of the fabric. Woven fabric cut on the bias has lots of stretch and it doesn't fray. So you can see I've placed my ruler on the fabric lining up the selvage with the 45-degree line. And now I'm just laying my pattern piece on top of the fabric so that I can check there's going to be enough room to cut it out. Now I'm just using a heat erasable marker to draw a line on the fabric so that I can see where to fold it. I'll then cut out the pattern piece perpendicular to this line. Again, I'm going to lay the pattern piece on top just to make sure that there's enough room to cut it out. Then I'm going to take a water-soluble fabric glue pen to hold down the pattern piece. You don't have to use one of these, you can use pins, you can use weights, it's just my favourite way to anchor down a small pattern piece. And as I said before, because this piece is cut on the bias, it means it has a nice amount of stretch to it. I'm just going to cut out the rest of the pattern pieces in exactly the same way. Again, I've used the glue pen for these pieces because they're only small. Once you have everything, we can start to prepare the pieces for sewing, and I'll prepare the pieces by finishing the edges with my overlocker. You could of course use a zigzag stitch instead. This is all clearly marked out in the pattern, and the red lines on the screen show you where I'm going to stitch. As well as the pieces that we've just seen, we also need to finish the short sides on the top and bottom skirt pieces. You can see I'm not cutting anything off the edge with the blade on my overlocker other than the odd stray thread, and again, a zigzag stitch is a great alternative if you don't have an overlocker. So I haven't trimmed any of my threads, and I'm just finishing off each side and moving on to the next. In quilting, we would call this chain piecing. Sometimes it's quicker to trim all the threads at once, especially when you're doing the same thing lots of times. Speaking of trimming threads, I'm going to trim them all down now, and you can see I haven't done anything special to finish off the ends of these stitches because they're all going to be stitched into other seams, so that's going to stop them from unravelling. Pressing after stitching is really important, and the overlocker's no exception. I like to give everything a quick press just to relax the threads and to make sure nothing's tight or being pulled out of shape. So I'm just going to quickly press all of the edges of the skirt pieces, and then we'll be on to the last step before we start construction. The last thing we need to do before we can start sewing is to transfer all of the notches and markings from the pattern pieces onto the fabric. This is going to help make sure we have everything in the right place and that everything fits together. I'm sewing the ruffle sleeve version, so on the centre front I only need the notches at the top and the bottom. And you can see that I just cut the notches with my fabric scissors. They're just small little V-shapes in the fabric. Just make sure that these are smaller than your seam allowance. Next, I'm going to mark the opening on the back pieces, and I like to do this by placing a pin through the centre of the marking and then pulling the pattern paper off. Once I'm happy with the pin placement, I'll go in with a water-soluble or a heat erasable marker pen, and I'll mark across where my stitching line should end. I'm going to do this on both of the back pieces, and then the last thing that I'll do is to mark a notch in the centre at the top of the ruffle sleeves. This isn't in the pattern, but it can help later on with construction. With all of the notches and markings transferred, it's time to start sewing. So we're going to start with the centre back seam. I'm going to take the two back bodice pieces and place them right sides together. Then I'll place a pin through the mark that I made earlier, and I'll take the pieces over to the sewing machine and sew from the bottom to the mark. For construction stitches, I'm using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and my stitch length and tension are on my regular settings. I'm just going to sew a straight line all the way up to my marking, and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Once it's stitched, I'm going to press the seam open, and I'll also press the unstitched portion at the top in exactly the same way. Pressing the seam open just means that one side of the seam allowance sits at either side of the stitching line. Then it's time for a visit from a furry assistant. Don't worry, this step isn't mandatory, and if you don't have one, you can go straight onto the shoulder and side seams. We'll place the front and back pieces right sides together and pin in place. Because the pieces are small, I'll just use one pin for each area that I'm going to stitch. Feel free to use more if you need to. Once it's pinned in place, I'll sew the shoulder seams and the side seams, and again I'm just using a regular stitch length for this and backstitching at the beginning and the end of each seam. As with any sewing project, it's important to press as you go. I use a couple of different pressing hams to help, but they're not completely necessary. Most of these pieces can be pressed flat, and you could just roll up a towel in place of the pressing ham if you don't have one. I'm just going to press each of the seams that we've just sewn open. The next step in the pattern is to finish the armholes. As I'm using the ruffle sleeve pattern here, the first step is to join the short ends right sides together. I'm still using my regular stitch length, and I'll backstitch at the beginning and the end of each seam. After pressing the seams open, we're going to hem the ruffles. Now as a beginner, it can be really helpful to use a long basting stitch here to give you a nice straight line to fold the hem along. When you use a basting stitch, it should be at your machine's longest stitch setting, and you can turn your tension down by a small amount too to make your stitches a little looser. Don't backstitch and leave the threads long, as we're going to remove these stitches later. Now we have a nice straight guide, we can do a single turn of the hem, folding along the stitch line and pressing in place. Next, to remove the basting stitches, we're going to gently pull on either the bobbin thread or the top thread, but not both. The thread should pull out fairly easily as the tension was loose and the stitches were long. Once the thread's removed, the other thread will just pull away. Once the basting threads are gone, we can then do the second turn of the hem. Turn up exactly the same amount again, making sure the raw edge of the fabric meets the fold that you're creating, and press in place. Back at the sewing machine, we'll stitch that hem down. I'm using a 3.5mm stitch length here, as I like the look of a slightly longer top stitch. Don't forget to set your tension back to normal also. We'll stitch all the way along and backstitch at the end. You can see that I'm keeping my fingers on the hem all the time, and this is so that I can feel the fold and make sure that it's caught under the needle all the way around at the correct seam allowance. This is what the ruffles look like so far, and now we can add the gathering stitches. To do this, we'll stitch 2 rows of long loose stitches which we can remove later. The pattern says to stitch 1 row at presser foot width from the edge of the fabric, and the second row at presser foot width from the first. Remember, stitches at your machine's longest setting, tension turned down a little, and leave the threads long to help with gathering and removing them later. The second row of stitches will help to create even gathers and works as a backup in case the first thread breaks. To attach the ruffles, turn your bodice wrong side out and your ruffle sleeves right side out. Place the ruffle sleeves inside the bodice. The centre top of the ruffle should match the shoulder seam, and the side seam on the bodice should match the seam on the ruffle. This helps to ensure that the gathers are even all the way around. Now we'll create the gathering. It's similar to removing basting stitches, except we don't want to pull the thread all the way out just yet. So we're going to gently pull on either the top or the bobbin thread on both rows of stitching and gather the fabric toward the centre. Keep checking the length of the gathered portion of the ruffle against the length of the armhole. Once you're happy that the sizes match, pin them in place. When you're happy with the first half, repeat for the second half, and then of course you're going to repeat the whole thing all over again for the second sleeve. When you're attaching gathered fabric to straight fabric, it's easiest to do this with the gathers face down on the feed dogs of the machine. The feed dogs will help to feed the gathers through and keep everything nice and even. Use your machine's standard stitch length and your normal tension. And of course, don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and the end. When you finish sewing, it's perfectly normal to still be able to see the gathering stitches on the outside of your garment. Don't worry, we're going to remove these next. Just like when you remove basting stitches, gathering stitches should come out nice and easily. Continue to pull the same thread that you used to create the gathers, and this will mean that the thread on the other side of the fabric will just pull away. Go nice and gently and be careful not to pull on any of your seam stitches. Here's what it should look like, and the next step is to finish that seam on the overlocker. Again, I'm not going to remove a great deal with the blade on my overlocker. In fact, I'm only going to remove the loose threads. Make sure to catch the ends of the other overlocker threads in to lock them in place. If you're using a zigzag stitch instead, exactly the same applies. Make sure you catch the bottom of the seams to lock everything in place and keep it nice and neat. Coming back to the beginning, you can see that I leave the thread to hang down into the machine so that it cuts off the excess thread, and then I just stitch a couple of centimeters over the beginning. Angle the garment away from the needles, stitch off the end and trim off the excess. Now onto the neckband. The pattern says to press 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, of one long side, wrong sides together. So to do that, I'm going to do exactly the same as I did for the ruffle hem and create a basting stitch first so that I've got a nice straight line to fold along. There are of course many other different methods that you can use for this. You can use a hemming ruler, you can draw a line, whichever is the most comfortable for you. This is just one method that you could use to help make things nice and easy. Once it's folded, remove the basting stitches, and then we're going to give it another quick press just to make it nice and neat. Then I'm going to finger press the hem by folding it in half and just pressing down with my finger. This creates a small non-permanent crease which will help us find the center to match up with the center front of the bodice. To attach the neckband to the bodice, the first thing I'll do is to match up the centers, and then I'll match up the ends. The ends of the neckband should be folded wrong sides together at the center back seam. And when we flip the neckband to the wrong side, we'll then create a loop in which to insert the elastic for the buttonhole. Once you have the center and the ends in place, then you can go around and add more pins, as many as you need, all the way around the neckband to keep it in place while we stitch. I'm using my regular 2.5mm stitch length and my regular tension to stitch all the way around, back stitching at the end. The pattern says to use a 0.75cm seam allowance. To me, that's somewhere around 1/4 of an inch, so that's exactly what I did. For some reason, everything else in my life is metric, but when I'm sewing, I can only sew in inches. When you get toward the end, just try and make sure that those edges match up as best as you can, because then when you flip the binding to the opposite side, you'll have a nice, straight, even seam down the back. The pattern then tells us to fold the neckband over and pin the pressed side exactly over your previous stitches. And then you'll stitch that in place, which will give you a very small neckband. However, I prefer to flip the binding all the way to the back and stitch it in place using it as a facing rather than a neckband. It does give you a very slightly lower neckline, but the beauty of sewing garments yourself is that you get to make these decisions. So, I'm going to flip the binding all the way to the back, and you can see that where the fold is, that is now the top of my neckline. I'll press it in place, making sure everything matches up, and then I'll take it over to the sewing machine and sew it down. Once again, I'm using that slightly longer 3.5mm stitch length for my top stitching, just because I prefer the way that it looks. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end, and I'm going to sew around very slowly, keeping my fingers on top to make sure that I can feel where the edge of the fold is. That way I can make sure that it stays under the needle and that my stitching stays even all the way around. You will need to adjust the fabric as you go around, as this is a curved edge. Just make sure any wrinkles in the fabric don't make it under your needle, otherwise you will stitch them in place. Give the neckband a press all the way around, and then it's time to insert the elastic into the back. So you can see that I'm using some really high-tech tools here, my seam ripper and a chopstick, to just insert in between the binding and the back piece. Unfortunately, I don't get 10 out of 10 for my camera work here. However, I was able to insert the elastic easily once I'd opened up that space in the back. Make sure nothing's twisted, and make sure your elastic is far enough in, because we're going to stitch it in place next, and we're going to top stitch all the way around the opening at the back. Again, I'm going to use that slightly longer 3.5mm stitch length for my top stitching because I prefer the way that it looks, and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning of this seam. I'm going to stitch all the way down to the bottom of the opening, but then I'm not going to backstitch, and I'm going to leave the needle down in the fabric. Once I get to the bottom with the needle down, I'm going to lift my presser foot up and I'm going to turn everything 90 degrees so that I can sew across the bottom of the opening. I'll take a couple of stitches and do exactly the same again and stitch up the other side, and then once I get to the top I can backstitch to secure everything in place. I finish backstitching and then I attach my button, just sewing it on by hand. Next up, we're going to sew the skirt pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is take the upper skirt pieces and fold them in half, right sides together. And I'm just going to place a notch in the top and the bottom of each of these, and this will help us to place them later on. Once that's done, I'm going to place them both right sides together, add some pins down the sides, and we're going to sew them together and press the seams open. And everything that I've just done for the upper skirt, I'm also going to repeat for the lower skirt. Now that everything's pressed and neat, we're going to create the gathers at the top of the skirt pieces. Both the upper skirt and the lower skirt have gathering along their top edge, so we'll repeat the process we used on the ruffles. Using a long stitch length and a slightly looser tension, we'll sew one row of stitching and then a second row. Generally, I'll stitch from side seam to side seam along the front, stop, and then repeat the process for the back. Remember, we're not going to backstitch and we're going to leave those threads nice and long. Now we'll attach the skirt pieces together. Turn your lower skirt wrong side out and your upper skirt right side out. Insert the upper skirt into the lower skirt and we're going to match up those notches and the side seams. The top of the lower skirt will join to the bottom of the upper skirt. Once you've pinned the centres and the side seams, you can start to create those gathers. Pull on only the bobbin threads or the top threads on both rows of stitching. Pull the gathers toward the centre until both pieces are the same width. Repeat this on both sides and then we can add lots of pins to hold it in place while we stitch. Repeat that all again for the back, again adding lots of pins, and then we'll take it over to the sewing machine and sew in place. I'm back to my normal 2.5mm stitch length and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Just as before, I have the gathered section face down on the feed dog so that the machine can help me to feed it through nice and evenly. Once you've finished sewing, don't forget to remove those gathering threads just as you did before, and then we're going to finish the seam either with a zigzag stitch or on the overlocker. This is exactly the same as before. I'm not going to take anything off with the blade of the overlocker and I'm just going to stitch all the way around. The skirt's finished and now we can attach it to the bodice. We're almost there. With the bodice right side out and the skirt wrong side out, insert the bodice into the top of the skirt. Again, match up all of your notches and all of your seams and pin them in place before we create the gathers. Create the gathers in exactly the same way as before by gently pulling on the bobbin threads and moving the fabric toward the centre. We'll do this on both sides at the front and the back. Remember to add lots of pins all the way around so that nothing shifts when you're sewing in place. Once again, stitch all the way around using your regular stitch length, and remember to keep the gathered portion face down on the feed dogs. Once you get to the end, don't forget to remove those gathering stitches and then finish the seam just as before with your zigzag stitch or with your overlocker. The last part of construction is to create the hem. I'm going to do this in exactly the same way as I did with the ruffle, as this is a double fold hem. I'll start with a long loose basting stitch all the way around, and that will help me when I'm folding the hem up to have a nice straight line. Using the basting stitches as my guide, I'll fold the fabric up wrong sides together all the way along that stitch, and I'll press. Then I'll remove the basting stitches just as before, and I can use the raw edge of the fabric as my guide to create the second fold of the hem, making sure that the raw edge of the fabric touches the fold that you're about to create. As you progress in your sewing journey, you'll find that there are lots of different ways to do things, including the double fold hem. There are lots of tools available to help with this if you wish to use them. You can get special presser feet that are designed specifically for this, you can get pressing rulers, you can even draw a line on the fabric to help you fold a straight line. As I said, the beauty of sewing your own garments is that you get to make these decisions. Finally, using my 3.5mm stitch length, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning, stitch all the way around the bottom of the hem, and backstitch when I get to the end. Give the dress a final press, and you're done.
Congratulations if you made it all the way to the end. Give yourself a pat on the back as you admire your new Lily dress. I'd love to see your version, so please tag me on Instagram if you post it over there. Let me know down in the comments below if you found this video useful, and don't forget to give me a thumbs up. Here is what YouTube thinks that you might want to watch next, and here is where you can subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy sewing. Hopefully I'll see you again soon.